I'm delighted to be back at Bosphorus Summit. I think I've been to this summit for the fifth or sixth time. I don't remember, but anyway, it's great to be back, and I understand there is quite a few people who have not been able to get some sort of seating, but I'll start. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, today, obviously, we're going to talk about global challenges. But I'd like to tell you about how Turkey is positioned while we go through this, a period of intense uncertainty, volatility, complexity, ambiguity. I have a few slides to go through, assuming I can get it to work. Yes, it looks like it's working. So yes, we've got global economic policy uncertainty that has peaked earlier this year. It was off the charts. While it has moderated, it still remains highly elevated. Similarly, if you look at global trade policy uncertainty, you get same picture. What sort of challenges are causing this type of, off-the-chart level of uncertainty? Well, we've got, obviously, trade fragmentation. We've got high global indebtedness. We've got aging populations. AI obviously promises immense potential to boost productivity, but at the same time, it's a complicated picture when it comes to regional disparities, whether or not technologies will be shared. Impending climate disaster is another concern. And finally, when we look around in our neighborhood, but actually beyond our neighborhood, what we see plenty of conflicts and tensions. So this is the type of backdrop, global backdrop. And that's the theme of this year's Bosphorus Summit. So what does it mean? Well, it means modest global growth prospects. IMF looks at, every year they produce 5-year growth projections. And we are, over the past few years, we're stuck at about 3%. Back in good old days, prior to global financial crisis, prior to all this, trade protectionism, we used to have forecast of 4.5% to 5% real GDP growth on a 5-yearly basis. So low growth clearly is something that is now considered as the new normal. How does Turkey, how Turkey has done over the past, let's say, 20, 25 years? When if you look at the last century, Turkey's real GDP growth rate is about 4.8%. If you look at the last 22, 23 years, growth has averaged to close to 5.5%. That's a pretty respectable performance. So when you look at it relative to emerging markets, and that's the red line, clearly when you compare that with similar countries, that's emerging markets excluding China, India, because they are very large, and that would be the yellow line. Turkey has done quite a bit of catching up with developed world while outperforming emerging markets. Even if you add China, India, the last 20, 23 years has been quite an impressive period. If you take 2002 equaling 100 as your base year and looking at GDP in constant prices. If I can go through my slides, I'll show you more. So which countries would you want to be in terms of investments? destination. You would like to be in countries that rely on domestic demand for growth and services exports, because protectionism has not yet, infected services component. It's more trade protectionism as we know of it in terms of trade of goods. So if you look at countries, I think Turkey would be one of them, because we tend to have heavy reliance on domestic demand for growth, and we have a very large services exports. For example, this year, services exports likely to amount to over $65 billion on a net basis. We've talked about protectionism being one of the main challenges. If that is the case, if global trade fragmentation is the new normal, how does Turkey deal with that? Well, we think we're less vulnerable. We're not immune, but we're less vulnerable. Why? Because much of our trade is destined to countries that we have free trade agreements. So we have free trade agreements with 54 countries. And if you also look at our trade with our immediate neighborhood, which would qualify, as friendly, countries. So in terms of, nearshoring, friendshoring included, essentially FTA countries and immediate neighborhood accounts for about well over 80% of our total exports. So as you can see, we think we will prove relatively less vulnerable. And as I said, services surplus is key. But of course, we're not going to sit there and wait to see whether or not trade fragmentation will hurt us. So we're looking at regional integration as a fix to global trade fragmentation. And what do we mean by that? Well, we're now investing in regional connectivity, and that's why we're trying to push through the so-called New Development Road from Persian Gulf to, obviously, Iraq, all the way to Turkey, to connect GCC countries and Iraq to both London and China, Beijing. Another, fix or another, let's say, solution would be to enhance existing free trade deals to include services, agriculture, and public procurement. And that's where UK comes in. We're at advanced stage of concluding a comprehensive free trade agreement. EU is a long shot, but it needs to be upgraded. We already have a customs union with EU. GCC countries, we are in the process of negotiating free trade agreements, and there are talks with Japan. And of course, we are investing in resilience of supply chains. I'm struggling occasionally to go through these slides. Well, maybe it will work. Maybe this way. All right, regional integration, clearly we have a great advantage, a geographic advantage. Relative to many other global routes, if you look at the so-called development road option in terms of trade with Asia, is the most efficient, by far the fastest route. And that's why investing in this new connectivity is key to Turkey, but also to region's prosperity. Services trade, we believe that while we have a very large surplus, we believe that upside is still massive.